Hello, and welcome to episode 56 of the Race Class Podcast. This is your host, John Feingold. I'm often here with Arnie Arneson, but today it's just me and a very special guest, Dr. Evelyn Carter, who's here to talk about her new book, Was That Racist? I hope you'll join us for a really incredible conversation touching on so many topics, and honestly, one of my favorite conversations that we've had this year, and one that's incredibly timely because just days before Evelyn and I recorded, I was having a conversation at dinner with my 6.5-year-old who was trying to understand, in his words, why is it that ICE is targeting people with dark skin? Why is it that ICE wants people with dark skin to go to jail? And even as a scholar of race and racism, it was hard to find the words to explain what's happening in this moment, and to really meet the concern and confusion coming from my child. And against that backdrop, I was particularly delighted to be in conversation with Evelyn because she is one of the smartest, most sophisticated, most thoughtful thinkers who I know when it comes to talking about race and racism, whether with adults or with 6.5-year-olds. And her book has advice for everyone, whether you're leading a Fortune 500 company or you're just a parent trying to figure out how to talk with your kid about race and racism at home. So now into my conversation with Evelyn to talk about her new book, Was That Racist?
Should we do it?
What?
All right. This is the Race Class Podcast with Jonathan Feingold. I am here today with a very, very, very special guest, Dr. Evelyn Carter, former colleague of mine, and who was actually the first ever guest on the Race Class Podcast. Do you remember that, Evelyn?
I do.
3 years ago, I think.
Oh my gosh. Yes, I do. Because I was sitting in the what is now my older daughter's room and like nothing had been set up yet. I remember it very vividly. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was the summer of 2022 because it was a part of a series of episodes on all of the ways that race matters before, during, and after higher ed admissions prior to the Supreme Court oral argument in SFFA v. Harvard. And brought you in order to talk about, I think, how race matters on campus, probably talking about social identity threat and stereotype threat is my guess.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we got you back. And we've got you back because you just wrote a book called Was That Racist? Question mark. How to detect, interrupt, and unlearn bias in everyday life. And so before we get into the conversation, I just want to ask where listeners can get a copy of your book, learn about your work, all that
Yeah.
good stuff.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for this platform. Thank you for having me back. And the simplest answer is that your listeners can find me online at evelynrcarter.com. I say that because if you go there, you will find a link to my publisher's website for my book. You will also find a way to sign up for my newsletter, which is hashtag there's a study for that. And then you'll also get all kinds of information on there about other interviews I've done, where to find me on social media. So evelynrcarter.com is just the place to start. That said, if you are shopping in your local area and there's an independent bookstore in there, pop on in and ask them if they have. Was that racist? If they do, buy it. And if they don't, ask them to order it for you.
Should you go up to the register and be like, "Hey, was that racist?" And then
I will tell you
and
what, I've had a couple funny stories that people have told me about people about, like the kind of double take that happens when folks are like, I'm looking for a book. I'm like, yes, what's the title? Was that racist? And it's like, what? Like, yeah. I'm not asking if you're racist. That's the title of the book. So yeah, good times.
I'm gonna test this out sometime soon. So, and thank you as well for being here. And I want to ask you how you're doing, and I'll invite you to respond however you want to. And I mean it in a like just an earnest,
Yeah.
real sense. It's as a as a scholar, something that's been tricky increasingly is that the most precise words to describe the moment are words that seem like impolite in different sorts of ways. But I do think, whether it's racial authoritarianism, racial fascism, the most precise, accurate words to describe the moment are actually, I think people are in some, you know, settings are just like, oh, are we allowed to say that? But that's the reality. Um, and, you know, I have a young kid, you have a couple young kids, and so even when times are, you know, quote unquote like normal times, it's still really hard. And you
Yeah.
do diversity, equity, inclusion work, which is hitting all sorts of it's having a different sort of moment right now. And so I guess I just love to hear how you're doing.
Yeah. So my kind of personal value that or not value, the personal belief that I have is that anytime I ask somebody how they're doing, I want to create space for a real answer. And when I am asked, I also give a real answer. And so I appreciate you asking. I am okay. Uh, I have a combination of like personal and professional things that are mixing in these weird ways, right? So like my younger daughter turns 1 in a little under a month. She has said her first word within the last few weeks, which was mama. So like I
Mm.
won.
Hmm.
Because my older daughter said dada first, and then it took her 2 months to say mama. Not that I'm counting. So like my kid's saying mama, she's walking. We had a weekend full of gatherings with friends who have become family, right? And so that's been really just like fulfilling. And I had warm coffee with the sun hitting my back this morning while I was holding my baby. So, like, that's great. I also am feeling very distressed about the state of the world. I am with you on kind of the most precise language to use to describe this time feels to me dramatic. Like it feels dramatic to be like we are experiencing like living through fascism, but like that's true. Um, and that's difficult. And so, I was having a conversation this morning with someone who was saying that they found themselves in a group chat yesterday where people were saying some pretty racist things about Bad Bunny. And um, the person who was messaging me is Latina, and she was like, I was so frustrated that there were people in there who knew my identity and didn't think twice about saying the things that they did, and that there were people who are not Latina or Latino who were in that chat who knew me and just let these comments go by. And she was like, I'm furious, and also like I have work to do. I've got like I can't let this consume me. And I feel like that's a perfect kind of way to categorize how I'm feeling right now, which is like I'm furious and I have work that I need to do, so I can't let that consume me. And I also have little ones who are looking up to me to hopefully make this world a better place. And while that is incredibly daunting, it's also incredibly grounding. So that's
Yeah.
my real long answer.
Well, thank you. So the next question I want to ask you is something that I ask everyone who, has this, comes on to this platform with me. And I don't think I asked the first time you were here. And the question is, where was your racial education? Which is meant to
Yeah.
be open-ended as an opportunity for you to share when, where, how you started to think about this thing we call race and racism?
Yeah. So you did not ask me this question first, and I was like, the first time, and I was like, oh, great, I get to answer this now. So um, a few places. So one kind of the first experience that I have that I remember being the target of racism is actually something that I talk about in my book in chapter 8. So, spoilers, but if you want to know what it is, you should read the book. Um, but I would say the ongoing conversation about race and racism is something that, as a young Black girl and now Black woman, just happened around my like the dinner table. So my mom has worked in diversity, equity, and inclusion in some capacity for basically as long as I've been alive, and we used to call her Ms. Diversity at home. And that was, she would always say, like, let's, whenever like one of us would make a joke or whatever, she's like, let's be more thoughtful about how what we're saying impacts others and all of that. So like that kind of conversation about diversity and representation and inclusion has been one that has been persistent throughout my life, and it's come up in a variety of ways. I also grew up with parents who had both personally experienced racism in a variety of ways, particularly as they went through the education system, and also grandparents who and aunts and uncles who like regularly talked about how racism showed up in their lives. So, for example, when I was in college, I was having a really hard time with the pre-med coursework that I was taking, as well as the biology major that I had declared. And I was talking to, and there were basically a lot of high high importance and challenging courses that were taken at a time when there were already a lot of other things going on in my college career that just really made it hard to juggle everything and do well. And so I remember going to a college counselor and getting some guidance on basically like how to manage. And they told me that I should change my major from biology to something else, not to change from being pre med, but just change my major. Um, and I remember telling my dad, and he was like, well, college counselors, like, we just have to be careful, like, about the guidance they're giving you because we don't want anybody to be discouraging you. And I was like, what are you talking about? And then we went on to tell me the story about my aunt who was discouraged by a college counselor from being pre-med, so much so that she did change her major to history and then ended up not doing any of the pre-med coursework. And basically, like, the dramatic version of the story is like she broke down in tears on graduation day because she realized that she wasn't going to be able to pursue her dream. And so then she ended up doing a post baccalaureate coursework so that she could, and she is a doctor now, right? But so to me, growing up, my racial socialization was very much about understanding that I am Black, that I am a Black girl, that I'm a Black woman, that the world around me is racist, and that I need to be on the lookout for it, and just be aware of others' intentions always. My dad always, I read Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison growing up, and my dad also used that as an example of why I shouldn't just blindly accept recommendation letters from anyone, because I need to make sure that they're actually speaking positively of me in private, not just in public, right? So there's all of these, like, watch out for the racism that is in the world in those conversations, and then also the, like, watch out for perpetuating that racism, right? Watch out for perpetuating the homophobia, the xenophobia, the whatever there is. So those were the conversations we were having, like, literally around my dinner table as I was growing up.
Thanks. And there's moments in the book where some of that surfaces, and just the both the vigilance,
Mm-hmm.
and reasons for the vigilance and why some of the signal, and because there's a part in the book, I don't know if we'll get deep into it today, but with respect to um, communicating values and whether or not it's
Mm-hmm.
performative, if it's not, how to think about it. But something that the book addresses is how, you know, part of the vigilance comes from just needing to know who you will be safe around.
Yeah.
And so some of the statements, are simply just, are markers that these are people with whom, you always, I guess, trust but verify, but it is still a signal that one will be safe against a backdrop where that's not, one can't necessarily take that for granted.
Yeah. Yep.
So the book title again, was that racist? There was a part of me coming in, the sort of playful, not super serious part of me that was thinking I would just throw 20 scenarios at you and just ask you, was that racist? Which I know is not actually drawing the right lessons from the book.
I do a little bit of that. I like to be playful on social media, so I actually do a little bit of that on Instagram. I'll like tell a story and then be like, "Was that racist? What do you think?" And it always brings out the trolls. So user beware.
But so I don't know, maybe we'll toss some of those in later. But and so I don't think I'm stretching, but when I was reading this book, and as a writer myself, I'm always thinking about audience. And when I'm talking with students, it's always a question of who are you writing to? Is it a public audience? Is it a judge in a courtroom? Is it to a supervising attorney? And here, there's a way in which the book that you write is a sort of a general audience book that has this incredible way of blending social science, empirical scholarship, and narrative. But I walked away getting the sense that there was actually a more sort of specific audience that you had in mind. So, and you should let me know if I'm wrong, but I sort of read this book as you speaking to what I would think of as a well-educated white audience who really wants to be fighting the good fight with respect to racism, but is not really sure where to start. Is
Yep.
that right? Or yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So that is absolutely it. The short version of how I describe who the audience is for my book is white people and anyone that interacts with white people. um, but to me, when I was pitching this to the publisher and really like talking about kind of how I wanted to describe the book, I said like this is the 2.0, so to speak, like the next level book that somebody who read White Fragility following the murder of George Floyd in summer 2020 should be reading. Although hopefully they've been doing a lot more reading between, the last 6 years. But the idea was like, I'm not going to prove in the book that racism exists. I'm not going to spend time justifying that this stuff is true. I'm going to dive in and tell you why you don't think that that is the case. I'm going to tell you why you're wrong, and how to fix that. And that was really important to me. So actually, some of the reviews that I've been proudest of are the ones that say like, this book is good for it has something for everyone. And my goal is that whether you are a learned scholar like yourself, right, or someone who I have a friend who is a white guy and he's like, this is the first book I've read in 5 years. I'm like, I want everybody to find something in this book for them. But what I also felt very strongly about was making sure that while I was writing for that kind of, like the well-meaning white folks audience, I, as a Black woman, always wanted to make sure that I was not leaving the folks of color behind. It's very important to that. And so as I was writing every single sentence, every single chapter, um, I was thinking like, what do I want the white person who is a colleague of the only Black person in the office to know, so that that Black person doesn't have to explain themselves to their white colleague, so that that Black person doesn't feel the weight of being a token anymore. And if you are not a white person reading this book, hopefully you find something in here that is the language that you can use to talk to those white folks in your life, or at a minimum just read it and be like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone, right? To give you the language, like, that's why they're like that. Ugh. So lots of work being done in those 200-ish pages or so. But yeah, well-meaning, well-educated white folks who want to do better, and anyone who interacts with them.
Well, I think your superpower sort of shines through in this book. That superpower is a reference to the first time you and I met
Yeah.
when I was working at UCLA and you applied to a position in this, office that we were in. Um, and there's and so the book I think really is does have something for everyone because so for someone like me who studies this stuff and is pretty nerdy, I was scanning the footnotes because, which to me, like I
Yes,
actually prefer footnotes as opposed to endnotes because I have to like jump to the end and come back.
I
But there,
know.
but there's a way in which it does really sort of, I think it just reflects sort of you. You're this like, um, you are an empiricist, a social psychologist, and it's constantly sort of churning through the research to answer questions, and to think through it. And um, there's a part of me where I do think it's too bad this book was not around in 2020, because I think
Mhm.
a lot of folks needed some of what was here. And um, One of the early themes in the book, or early concepts in the book, is this notion of a growth mindset. And I think folks, probably many listeners, have heard the term growth mindset as opposed to fixed mindset, but maybe not with respect to how one approaches anti-racism. And so before I jump into some of the other aspects of the book, I was just hoping you could explain for everyone what it means to have a growth mindset and how that relates to quote unquote detecting, interrupting, and unlearning bias in everyday life.
Yeah. So first of all, I just have to say I love that you were reading the I don't remember if they're called footnotes or endnotes. I don't, but the notes at the back of the book, because I packed so much into there, and it's kind of where I let my kind of nerd flag fly, so to speak. But also, I was just being kind of sassy sometimes. Like there's a lot there, and one of the things that makes me sad about when I recorded the audiobook is that I did not record the end notes. And so if you are an audiobook listener, please just like download the associated PDF so that you can get all the goodness. But yeah, so growth mindset. So a growth mindset is the general idea that the belief people have that our talents, abilities, skills, personality traits are malleable, that they can change based upon effort, circumstance, time, what have you. And you contrast this to a fixed mindset, the belief that our talents, personality traits, skills, what have you, are set in stone. You're born with a set amount, and that's all you get. The kind of quintessential example of a fixed mindset is you either have it or you don't, right? So when it comes to bias and detecting racism, what research shows is that you can have a growth mindset about bias as well. And what that means is that you are someone, if you have a growth mindset, that believes that bias is not fixed, that it is not this kind of like label that one earns and, kind of like the scarlet letter or what have you, but rather it's something that people have as a certain amount as a starting point, but that can be changed over time due to effort, due to time, due to circumstance. And the reason that I love that concept and how it's applied to bias is that research shows that when you have a growth mindset about bias, it changes the way that you respond to feedback that you are biased. So, what research finds is that if I'm somebody that has a growth mindset about bias and I get feedback that's like, hey, Evelyn, you said something that was inappropriate, or you did something that may have advanced racial inequity or whatnot. If I have a growth mindset about bias, I'm going to say, oh my goodness, tell me more. I want more feedback. I want to learn about about what I did, why it was harmful, because I know that learning more is going to help me avoid that in the future. If I have a fixed mindset about bias, I am going to be like, what? I'm not. You just called me racist. Oh my gosh, I'm going to freak out and I'm going to shut down and I'm going to miss an opportunity to change because I don't believe I can change. I believe you just told me the worst possible thing about me. What is also cool about this fixed versus growth mindset is that research also shows that if you have a growth mindset about bias, you are more likely to call out, to interrupt bias, right? So if you think about it as a means of effort, if I don't think that you can change, I'm not going to tell you when you did something that was harmful because what's the point? But if I believe that you can change, then I want to give you that feedback because I believe that feedback is going to do something, maybe not in the short term, but certainly in the long term to change your behavior, your attitudes, what have you. And so a growth mindset about bias is helpful both for driving personal accountability and change when you get feedback that is, that you've done something or said something harmful. And it's also beneficial to have a growth mindset about bias because it shapes our willingness to call out others in a way that is going to help them change for the better.
Thanks. It's like so many directions I want to take this,
I know.
including, there's a part of the book talking about bystander intervention, or like third
Yeah.
party person sees something happens that's problematic, and how they should respond. And one thing that's just so interesting in the text is actually it shows some of the sort of development in your own thinking, where it's like, yes, you have to intervene, but the way you intervene
Yep.
might matter. And I think growth mindset is part of that, and the way that you communicate to someone what they did, and how um, they should do it differently. And I mean, I will just also confess that I was getting a little distracted in the end notes because, like you said, you tell like a whole other story there. You can learn
Yeah.
about, when you went out to Thai in Indiana for Thai food,
Yeah.
and the white baseline. Um, um, but uh, and also just with growth mindset, it's really interesting how this, a concept that in a sense is, about um, the fact that the very way in which we sort of just subjectively understand our ability to do different things, whether it's something that we just like innately have or it's something we get through hard work, actually shapes our ability to get better at it. And I
Yep.
think it was probably through you where I was exposed to research on how like high performing students who had a fixed mindset, when the first time they struggled, they they actually were not perseverant because
Yep.
they had this sense of, oh, I actually now hit my cap,
Yep.
and now I'm topped out, as opposed to, oh, it turns out that I was able to do that because like I was working hard in the right kind of ways. And yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's fascinating. And I remember when I had a student actually when I was in grad school who was a research assistant, and she started off and was struggling with some of her early coursework. And she was working in our lab, so she's exposed to research around growth mindset and fixed mindset all the time because that was some of the work that my advisor did, some of the research that she did. Um, and I remember one of the conversations with that undergrad, and she was like, "I get what you're trying to do in terms of instilling a growth mindset in me, but I'm not there yet." And I remember the pride that I felt when she graduated and then went on to get her own PhD, studying some of these concepts, right? But her senior year when she graduated, she was like, I get it now. Growth mindset all the way. So yeah, it is really transformative in every avenue of life. And so, I mean, hats off to Carol Dweck because like she really did her business on that one. It's a great concept that really has so many different applications.
And I think that's not unrelated to one of the through lines in your book and in the research that you draw on, but it's really engaging and taking seriously the psychological and emotional responses that people experience when talking about racism.
Yep.
Um, and there's and oh, did I put a bookmark? I think I did. Oh yeah, so like one subheading, white people's experiences with racial bias. And so that's a little bit different. It's, when white people are sort of experiencing
Yeah.
bias. But then there's this other one where I'm going to read from in a second, where the subheading is talking about racial bias creates disequilibrium and discomfort. And
Yeah.
so I think of folks like Rachel Godsell who've talked about racial anxiety and how
Yep.
racial anxiety manifests in different ways and how to navigate it. But so I'm going to read a passage from the book, and then I'm going to essentially ask you to elaborate and to translate
Cool.
for a lay audience. So okay, so yeah, I'll just read it all. Decades of research has explored why some white people respond in such outsized and often hostile ways to interracial interactions and or conversations about racism. Landmark research conducted by Dr. Jennifer Richardson and Nicole Shelton offers one explanation, that interracial interactions undermine white people's executive functioning or quote unquote brain power. And then a parenthetical that I'll just include. For what it's worth, no group leaves interracial interactions psychologically unscathed. In later studies, the same researchers discovered that interracial interactions also drain cognitive functioning for people of color, though for different reasons than they do for white people. Can you elaborate what's going on? What are you alluding to here?
Yeah. So basically, so this research, Dr. Jennifer Richardson was my undergraduate advisor at Northwestern University, and I was just fascinated by this work that basically the idea is that when you are, as a white person, in an interracial interaction, um, and there are some modifiers here, right? So when you are a white person who is, depending on the research you're looking at, who is aware that bias is a possibility, right? So like you're aware that bias exists in the world. When you are a white person who cares about not being biased, um, basically you spend a lot of energy and brain power making sure that you don't come off that way. So you're in your head. It's like the highest level of self-monitoring possible. So every time you say something, you're like, was I racist? Uh-oh, was it like, should I smile more? I'm going to smile. Okay, cool. What did that mean? They made that facial expression to me. And all of that is what's happening as you're just trying to have a regular conversation with the Black person across the table from you. And I am, I say this every time, people are always surprised. I am an introvert. I find social interactions mostly very draining. And the reason that they are often draining for me is because I'm spending so much time being like, was that awkward of me to say? Oh, is that cool? And so anybody who has had that experience, whether you're a white person in interracial interaction or you're just an introvert who is like, please get me to that dark, quiet room. When you spend so much time in your head trying to analyze the thing that you are actively doing, right? The conversations that you are having, the words that are coming out of your mouth, it is very cognitively taxing. And that is what doctors Richardson and Shelton were able to capture and quantify in their research.
Um, do you mind? And so that's interesting, and I really appreciate how you sort of bring yourself in, which also, comes through in the book. But it's like I think a lot of people in different contexts, would probably self-identify with like this. I don't know if insecurity is the right word, but this like deep self-awareness and self-consciousness
Yes.
of just
Yes.
wanting to be very careful to not mess up and worrying that what you say is going to offend someone, not necessarily in a racial context, but almost inevitably that also just creates awkwardness
Yes.
because you are not able to
Yes.
and so it's um you know I guess to me it would seem like predictably would create this like feedback loop where the person on the other end is also like, is this person being a little weird or a little
Yeah.
awkward?
Yeah.
And like everyone actually wants, well, I guess I shouldn't assume, but like, um, no one is necessarily acting in bad faith or
Yeah.
maliciously, but it can create these dynamics that are um, a function of the interracial interaction.
Yeah. So there's actually some really interesting, like ironic kind of consequences of this. So there's research that finds that white folks who are high in what's called their like motivation to respond without prejudice, basically like white people who really want to not be prejudiced, who like for whom it's very important to not be prejudiced, um, actually are perceived as more racist by folks of color in interracial interactions compared to white people who don't care about not seeming racist and who actually probably do harbor more racist beliefs, right? And the reason is that if you are a person of color interacting with a white person who is racist and doesn't care, they are free. They're just out here having a conversation. They are not self-monitoring. They're not doing that awkwardness because they're not trying to hide anything, versus a white person who knows about the biases that they may and do harbor are so awkward because they're trying to hide it that it ends up seeming like they're awkward because maybe they don't want to talk to me as a person of color, and ooh, are they racist? So there's all of these interesting things about it. And what I think is also important to emphasize is that the antidote to all of this is more conversations, more interracial interactions, right? Like the more practice you get, the more you realize, like, okay, I probably am going to mess up, but I know that because I have a growth mindset, that doesn't mean that I'm a horrible person. And the person I'm talking to will tell me about myself, and then I'll recover and move on, right? Or I'll build a relationship based on trust with this person. Will they'll begin to learn who I am and what I stand for, and so I won't have to be worried about every single thing I'm saying and how it's interpreted because I'll just be able to be free. So there's this really kind of like learning curve that happens when you are a white person in an interracial interaction, that if you have a fixed mindset or if you are just flat out racist and don't care, you don't engage in the learning. And so you don't see the benefit of that effort that somebody else who sticks with it might see. But it is pretty awkward at the beginning.
So this is man, I actually want to take the conversation in two different ways at the same time, which I like just under the laws of physics, I don't think I'm able to do. So, all right, I'll hold this second thought for a question that I'm going to come to in a little bit,
Okay.
but in part because I think the way that you just responded, because I was going to say, okay, imagine someone comes to you and they're like, all right, well, how do I, avoid like wanting to do the right thing, but then coming off as the person who actually is more racist than the person who actually harbors, the sort of racist beliefs. There's this great section of your book on microaggressions.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to read from that. And I was so interested in how you're going to tackle this because I personally have just found the sort of the basic, just a fundamental sort of concept of a microaggression, and that is like really helpful because at a minimum, or because it offers language and vocabulary to capture how little things, when they're constant and always accumulating, actually can have a massive impact. But the way in which that concept and understanding has often been operationalized into sort of institutional policy and just the way that we talk about it leads to just predictable sorts of resentment and backlash that I don't think is necessary and can and do more harm than good. So I'll read and then I'll yeah, just ask a slightly more specific question for you to respond
Okay.
to. Precisely because microaggressions can be so ambiguous, participants in my bias trainings often ask for a list of specific examples so they can avoid committing them. My answer is unsatisfying. And so this is where in the margin I've got a big star. Um, Not only will I not provide a list, no such list exists. If it did, it would require constant updates and a heavy disclaimer that what may be a microaggression to one person may be unobjectionable to someone else. And then a parenthetical, remember, impact carries more weight than intention. The bewilderment, the bewilderment I'm met with when I give this answer is palpable. How am I supposed to know what to say or what not to say if you can't give me a clear answer? So, yeah, I guess, do you want to elaborate on that? And then I also
Yeah.
connected to it. I would just love to hear any thoughts you have on anti-bias training generally, because a
Yeah.
conversation that we've had for many years is that there's just like strong negative reactions to anti-bias trainings, which could be because there's something inherent about anti-bias trainings, or that these trainings are really bad. And as sort of on a like a footnote to this, and then I'll get out of my own way. A good friend of mine is in the um, plant-based like meat business, and we had this conversation how there's a lot of people who have a negative association with plant-based meats because they've tasted really bad plant-based meat.
Yes.
Not be and so it's
Yes.
and then that just turns people off in a deep sort of way to ever going there. So yeah, so let me stop talking. I'd love to hear you talk more about the microaggression stuff, just your how you think about anti-bias trainings,
Yep.
any and all.
Great. Okay. So with respect to microaggressions, it's actually funny because there wasn't really, when I submitted my first outline to my editor, microaggressions wasn't a topic I was planning on bringing up. And it's because I have a disdain for how the term and the concept has been co-opted and kind of like willfully misconstrued in many of the ways that you just described, right? I think that microaggressions is kind of like when implicit bias slash unconscious bias, or the bias that we don't know about, got out there in the zeitgeist, that people were like, everything is implicit bias. And it's like, no. And then now people are like, everything is a microaggression. It's like, no, you didn't call me the N word because you were committing a microaggression. That's something entirely different. But it's so useful to have that language to partially just to describe part of what the experience of racism, how it can manifest. So I was apprehensive about talking about microaggressions because I just knew that people were going to be like, well, Evelyn, like, how come it's okay for one person to say that they like want to touch your hair, but another like whatever? And actually, it's a bad example. Nobody should touch my hair. But at any rate, I landed on talking about it in the book in the most authentic way that I could, which is my experience when people come to me about microaggressions and wanting to learn about them is exactly that passage that you just read. They're saying like, okay, well then like, what's the list? Oh, you can't give me a list. This isn't really real then. Haha, gotcha. And it's like, no, it's that so much of our understanding about racism is based upon how the person doing the racism sees things, right? The intention that they have. And I think microaggressions is very difficult because it's kind of difficult concept people understand because it's all about the impact. It's all about how what you said or did landed for me. And I get to decide whether it was a microaggression or not. It means the power is not in the person who is doing the behavior, it's all in the receiver. And for white folks, especially those who are worried about being perceived as racist, who are used to being in positions of power, knowing that they could do something and regardless of what they meant, it could still land badly, I think is very threatening. So I talked about microaggressions in the book because I have a very good editor who was like, white people need to hear this. And I also am very glad that I was able to talk about it in a way that was true to the message that I wanted to get across, which is like, I can't give you a list, bruh. But,
And I, oh,
no, that just like, that's it. I can't give you a list, bruh.
and part of it, which, after where I stopped reading from the book goes on, it also talks about context
Yeah.
and relationships
Yep.
and all of these dynamics that cannot be captured by a list. Now, lists can be useful to the extent they're helping to sort of surface the context that
Yes.
matters in a particular place and why it is we might be want to be attentive to one thing or another thing. Um, but it also doesn't surprise me the angst
Yeah.
that someone would feel when they're wanting to figure something out. And part of the answer is, oh, there is no
Yeah.
clear answer. Part of this is just understanding more about the world and how different people's experiences are in it and actually building meaningful relationships with them.
Yep.
Um, and
And that, to the point where you were saying, at the beginning, like you're gonna the joke about just like tossing out a bunch of scenarios and being was that racist? One of the reasons that I love the title of my book, Was That Racist? Question mark, is because I, as a Black woman, as a scholar who has studied this work, the research around racism, and who has lived it in a variety of ways and who's grown in a particular context, like I have an answer for every scenario that you might, provide of was that racist or not to me. And I also know that there is a kind of general perception about what things are racist or not, depending on your context and whatnot. But what I want for my audience, people who are reading the book, who are listening to this podcast, who are learning about microaggressions in a training or what have you, I don't want them to ever understand that there is a checklist of yes, do this, or no, don't do that when it comes to racism. What I want is to help them learn the skills necessary to contemplate whether the answer is yes and no, and why that might be different depending on who they're talking to, and the identities that they have, why that might be different depending on the way that they are feeling that day, right? Like, I want to teach people how to notice. I do not want to teach people the black or white, yes or no of anything. And so, as an educator, that's also why I can't give a list, right? Because I wouldn't be doing my job if I told you what the answer was. I want you to learn how to grapple with it for yourself and to learn how to have those conversations and to sit with the fact that there isn't a yes or no answer sometimes. It's a lot of it depends. And that's something that is a skill that you need to learn how to process.
and related to all that, one of the other, I think, really valuable observations and takeaways from the book is that when you live in the United States and you are someone who's racialized as white, that shapes how you experience and understand the world.
Yes.
And it
Yes.
is, and so there's so much that we can't get into that's responding to um, claims and calls for neutrality and objectivity that are anchoring to a sort of general or sort of average sort of white perspective,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
we don't. And so I just want to invite you to share a little bit about one of the personal examples that you offer in the book that I think does a nice, it's playful as opposed to some of the other examples that are maybe a little heavier, but that I think does just such a nice job of placing into such sharp relief how whiteness is a perspective, but is, just treated as,
Yeah,
an
yeah.
absence of a white. And so there's this, so you were a tour guide at Northwestern, is that right? Yeah.
I was, yes.
And I saw, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but I think there was a day when one of your classmates, another tour guide, white woman, she got really excited because her hometown had just been listed in like a New York Times or People or Us or whatever magazines, like
Yeah.
top 10 best places to live. And your response is like, and I forget if this was out loud or in your head. It's like, oh, maybe for white people. Um, and then she's like, nah, for everybody. And then on your phone, you go and you just like Google it and like top 10 places for black people. And it is like, I don't know if was there any over?
There is
Yeah.
no
So,
overlap.
yeah.
No, zero overlap. Yes, okay. So I'll tell you what. So the it in my book, because I share so many personal stories, I took great care to protect the identities of folks, except for when I knew it was like a wildly positive example, like when I'm talking about you, because you do show up in there. But so anyway, I will not reveal uh, the publication that it was, because if I do, it'll be very obvious which city, town, and state I'm talking about, and then it will be easy to trace back who the person that I'm speaking with is. But it was a
Yeah.
national publication. It was like a big deal. And yeah, this, I mean, like young woman from, Midwestern everyday town talking about how their place is the best place to live for white people. And I actually did say it out loud, right? It was one of those like, oh my God, did I really just say that? I was like, oh, you're not like, this is a list where white people can like, can live. She was just aghast. She was like, no, it's not. Like, this is where anybody would enjoy. And one of the things that I loved about that conversation is that she was really open to the feedback. And so I literally just pulled up a Google page and I was like, top 10 cities for Black people to live in. And it was, like a very different list, as you mentioned. And what we talked about is how, for her as a white woman, as a white young girl growing up, safety and, kind of best places to live didn't factor in what it had to for me as a Black girl, which is the lack of safety at being the only or one of the few people who looked like me. And as in the book, I talk about a few examples of that, one of which is, buying hair products. And the CVS in the town where I grew up always had the Black hair care products locked behind locked up, and we had to go find somebody, and they were always hard to find, and to get a key to unlock them. And there were all of these moments where it's just like, this place isn't built for you, this place isn't designed for you, that my friend never had that experience. But as I revealed to her, I'm like, if I'm a Black person growing up in this town that is like 90% white, I don't see people who look like me. The people who are around me have never seen somebody that looks like me, and so they have all kinds of assumptions that impact how I am treated. Like, that is not the best environment for everyone. And she got it, which was just like, again, a testament to why these conversations are so important. um, but yeah, the kind of the white default is strong, and helping white people in particular, unpack that and realize that like their experience is not a neutral one, but it is a racialized one, just like mine is a core part of helping white people understand racism.
And no, so that's all exactly right. And it's racialized, but in a quite different way
Yeah,
because you are not constantly having to be vigilant for your safety.
yeah.
And like out of concern that, the state through police or other are going to, you know, now that's changing in certain respects. And so I think there is this moment where, um, uh, so a colleague of mine recently was on a local NPR station, an immigration law expert, and there was a, question from a radio host, about, whether whether certain tactics that ICE is engaged in Minneapolis is crossing some line or not. And one of the points that she really attempted to convey was that the experience that certain middle class white people are having in Minnesota is an experience that communities of color have long had in the United
Yes.
States. And
Yes.
I think even when we say those words, it's really hard to actually, I think it's, and I bet there's a study for this, but I would ha have to imagine that it's really hard for people who are sort of racialized as white to believe that, because if that's true, if what middle class white people in Minnesota, what they're experiencing, communities of color have long experienced, then that means this place we live in is a horrific place.
Yes.
And that cuts against, sense of self and personality and just all of the stories that one's own identity is embedded within.
Yeah. So there are lots of studies for this, and they go back toward kind of the way that people see the world. So there's like various frameworks that social psychologists have investigated around how people make meaning of the things that they do, and so they're what's referred to as a set of system justifying beliefs. And so one of those beliefs is the belief in a just world. And the idea, if you have a belief in a just world, is that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. What that also means is that it's not just, it goes in the other direction too, that if bad things happen to you, well, then you must be a bad person. And if good things happen to you, then you must be a good person. And this one example of a system justifying belief cuts in ways that you might predict along gender lines. So, for example, somebody who is high in this kind of view of the belief in a just world is more likely to engage in victim blaming when they learn about sexual assault, for example, right? Folks who have a belief in a just world are also less likely to believe in and to want to combat racism or other isms because bad things happen to bad people. You must deserve it, kind of, is the idea. So yes, it's a very kind of it's hard to wrap your mind around. So what I going back to what you were saying before about the psychological kind of underpinnings of these beliefs of racism and in whatnot is that part of what we are battling right now is the kind of mental gymnastics of white folks not wanting to realize that the worldview that they have used to justify so much that they have seen needs to change. And when you are asking someone to change their worldview that they have had for 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years, that's very, very threatening. And so I have some sympathy for that, um, while also recognizing that like you kind of got to get on board quickly, because people are literally dying in the streets, and you've got to wake up.
Um, so also s- with this example from the book and with others, there were moments where I sort of was teleported back to when I was in, I think this happened when I was in college. And so I was someone who was always intuitively, um, in social justice spaces and specifically interested in, curious about race and racism. But there was a moment, and I think it was in a class I took my junior year in college that was essentially an introduction to critical race theory, where there was this moment where like a switch flipped and I just saw race everywhere where I hadn't before. And then it was like if you imagine if you had like Google goggles on or whatever, and it's just like tagging everything in like it's like black, white, black, and in a
Yeah,
way that had never been, you know, um so self-conscious, even if it was like
yeah,
operating one way or another. And I remember it being just like disorienting, but just like, what is going on?
yes,
Um, and for whatever reason, it wasn't the sort of thing where that happened, and then I like tried to run away and bury and take cover. But I think of that when, in moments. the dynamic of, efforts to have conversations about race or racism, and then one of the reactions being, like, you are now making everything about race and racism, when it's like,
Yeah.
oh, we're just having this one conversation. But it's possible that there's you are now, you know, confronting this new, like, I don't know, Google goggles reality of
Yeah.
the world, and it's a little uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, it's uncomfortable. It's overwhelming. I actually it's funny you say this because chapter 5 was one of the hardest chapters for me to write. Chapter 5 is all about systemic racism, and that is one where I basically start to pull at the thread of racism in systems, and there's a lot of yarn to pull there. And as I was writing it, um, the internal voice that I had was like, "Oh my God, Evelyn, like stop making everything about race." And I was like, "This is like nobody's gonna want to read this book. Like you are ruining everything." And I actually in the chapter, I think about halfway through the chapter, I say like, "This is really hard to write about, and it's hard to read about." Because it was I felt overwhelmed with I would start off with um, an example of for example, I talked about this when I did workshops, like talking about an example of buying a house, and my experience as a Black woman buying a house and also being on the other end and selling a house and thinking about the value that my house that I lived in was being appraised for, and how that's really like there was just all of these examples that I had in my brain that I wanted to unpack for folks, but I was like, this is a lot to, basically pull up this thread about buying a house, an exciting quintessential American experience, and being like racist. Um, but it is, and that's the issue with systemic
Yeah.
racism, is that it's everywhere and it's embedded in our systems. And what I have decided is that while that can be entirely overwhelming, it can also be, I think, empowering, because it means that there are lots of places where we can have an impact if we just do something. And you touched on kind of the discourse around anti-bias training, and I will just touch on that to say I've literally written a paper on it. And what research shows is that anti-bias training is most effective when it works on raising awareness and changing behavior. And to your point, I love the point about the plant-based meats friend of yours, because I imagine that much like me, that person has to do a lot of re-educating as they are also trying to advance their product, right? I have often said that as a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, my work is as much a PR game as it is a like true re-education game. I have to get people to stop being so afraid to get their butts in the seats to talk about DEI before I can even begin the conversation about why they're there. And I recognize the importance of that work, which is why chapter 5 is not chapter 1 of my book.
Well, chapter 5 is also a great chapter because I get a shout out in it.
Yeah.
Right here, page 122. Everyone should
Yeah.
just start reading there. Um, but it is also a really important chapter. And there's so when I teach critical race theory, which I often do in the fall, there is a paper that I um assign, and part of it has this narrative component where one of the authors is Black, going through dialysis, and very aware of the sort of racial discrimination that exists in the healthcare sector, and specifically with respect to dialysis
Yeah.
patients,
Yeah.
which we know is true in housing, because just a couple of years ago, big report from the federal government on all the different types of ways, both what we would think of as standard discriminatory treatment, treating individuals differently on the basis of race, impact facially things differently. And part of the takeaways from the paper that I uh, have my students read is that part of the one of the harms of existing in a racist society is simply knowing that your group is treated worse.
Yeah.
And the book, and you say like it, like, whether or not, I don't think anyone ever needs to say it is all about race, but race and racism are everywhere, because how could
Yeah.
they not be, given the
Yeah.
project of this, society that we live in.
Yeah.
So we have about five or so more minutes, and so I actually I think if it's okay, I'd like to turn to parenting
Yeah.
because so I I mean I'm pretty well versed in a much of the social psychology research with respect to implicit social cognition research on race. I was I was caught off guard by how quickly my kid started to absorb and
Yes.
then reproduce um, all of the just the socialization process. And for him, it was like the first thing that I really noticed was with respect to gender.
Yep.
Um, and race has come in different sorts of ways, but I just know as a parent and with other parents, like it's so hard to be a parent. It's so hard to be a parent in this country when we do nothing to take care of parents.
At all.
It's like, oh, my goodness, like, um, so I'm just wondering if, have of any pieces of advice for how parents should think about talking with their kids about racism. And I say that, like, I guess maybe I should just like name that that's the sort of question that is probably you're most likely to get from someone who's white, who is not feeling like there's an existential need to be talking with their kid about race and racism in a way that it might be different for a non-white parent.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I get that question. There's like a kind of a certain angle that that question has when it's coming from a white person, but I do get that question from people of color. But you're right in that it is distinct because when folks of color are asking it, they're basically asking like, at what point do I explain to my kid that their friend, like I literally the situation that somebody said, like, at what point do I explain to my kid that they are getting ignored by their friend on the playground because they are the only brown kid in their class? Like, at what point do I talk about that? Versus for white parents, it's at what point do I tell my children that some people don't see everyone as racially equal? It's like, dude. So for the white folks who are basically like, if you have a white child who isn't going to understand the impact of racism in the kind of negative way based on their lived experience of it, um, I think the first thing you do is you follow their lead. So, it is around the age of 3 when kids start to notice difference. They usually do notice gender first, partially because in school, and just like as parents, we are very gendered in how we talk about things. Was like, okay, boys line up here, girls line up there. It's also very binary, right? Which has some challenges if you are raising a non-binary child or if you are a non-binary person, non-binary gender identity, I should say. But they notice that, and so what kind of in that same way that some folks resistance to talking about racism, you make everything about race and to shut down, as parents we have to avoid the tendency to shut down when our children bring to us these things that they notice. And what we also have to recognize is that every single conversation we have with our children is an opportunity to shape their worldview. So for example, when my niece asked me why there were so many homeless people, why there are so many people living in tents on the sidewalk in Los Angeles, I had an opportunity to instill in her a worldview about why homelessness exists. And there are some people that would have answered that question with, well, they need to get a job and they're lazy, versus me, who, rather clunkily, I will admit, said, like, well, they don't have a place to live. Why don't they have a place to live, Auntie? Well, it's crowded in LA and there's not enough housing for everyone, and the housing that does exist is not affordable for everyone because people are holding on to the buildings and driving the rent sky high so that they can make a profit, and capitalism is bad, right? Like, and that's what my 5-year-old niece got. And so when your kid is coming to you saying, like, I've noticed that person that this friend is wearing different clothes than I am, or that it has some holes in her. I'm noticing that my friend has darker skin. You, as a parent, have an opportunity to impart upon them a worldview that is inclusive or one that is not. And that doesn't mean that you have to have all of the answers, but just like drawing out of like, what did you notice and why? And what I would say is if you are not someone that feels equipped to have these conversations, because, not everyone, John, is an amazing professor of critical race theory like you are, it's like look to books, look to stories that do this well. So a quick other personal story, I have two daughters. One is darker skinned, one is lighter skinned. And we have a good friend who is a black white biracial couple, and their daughter is very fair skinned. And the three girls are all very close. They were taking a bath together recently. And my friend's daughter said, "Well, why does the baby have light skin like me? And my older daughter doesn't have light skin like me." And I said, "Well, it's because of something called melanin. You and the baby have less melanin than baby G." And she said, "Oh, okay. Does that mean I get more of something?" Well, because we're different. And we read a book called Our Skin that talked about melanin, that also talked about racism and colorism and whatnot. And at one point while we were reading it, the friend's kid said, "Okay, so because I'm lighter, I get to do this, and baby G does not." It's like, well, that's what the world would tell you. But we don't like that, right? Because you're not better than baby G because you have less melanin. She's like, "Yeah, no." And you wouldn't want baby G to feel bad because of who she is. No, right. So we have to remember that melanin is a thing that we have, or some of us have more of it, some of us don't. But that doesn't mean we treat people differently because of how much melanin they have. Just, yeah. Okay, good talk. Good night. Bye-bye. Right? Like, and practicing for parents, like the adult in me, right? Like my heart was pounding. It's like, oh my God, I don't want to make this like little light skinned girl think that she's better than, my daughter because she's darker. But like, I have to, as an adult, work through that own feeling on my own and instead realize that what's in front of me is a 4-year-old who is asking me how the world works. And I have an opportunity to share with her not necessarily the world as it is, but the world as I want it to be, and help her understand that gap and how she can stand in it to make that world a better place. I hope that answered your question.
So, I mean, yes, and folks should read the book because the book has a lot more. Something that I just have to, I do have to correct the record. All of A lot of my good parenting is a product of my spouse who did, and
Oh,
this is a very gendered story, um, but who did a lot of research, a lot of
yeah.
listening to podcasts and reading books and trying to figure out how to parent in a way that wasn't just, relying on some path dependency of how we were parented in different sorts of ways, the good and the bad, but actually taking this seriously. Um, uh, and so I've become a better parent because of my spouse, but there is a way in which, between 3 to 6, kids their eyes are just so they're just observing the world. They're taking it
Yes.
in, and there's so much opportunity not to be I get being afraid of it, um, but to not be scared, to not try to say, oh, well, don't see that,
Yep.
um, and just to talk through it, and I will also, I guess, a shout out to all of the amazing early childhood educators in my kids' life
Yes.
who have been, great in all sorts of ways. The local library is an incredible place. There's a drag queen story hour we went to. Some point, it's just so many
Yep.
spaces where you're just, it's certainly not just exposure, um, but exposure that is counterbalancing, the
Yes.
way in which, all the sort of messaging sort of, shapes the way that we see the world. But that's just all to say, people should read the full book. They should, you know, I don't know, call you, email, I guess not call you, email you to figure out how, they can learn more from you.
Yes, absolutely. And they should pay me to consult with them so that I can help them build better organizations. And John, I think so I'm an improviser by training and I love a good callback moment. And so I think the story that you just told is a great callback to the power of a growth mindset, right? That like when you believe that there is something to learn, when you believe that you can be better by gathering more information, by trying and getting it a little bit wrong, but adjusting for the future, like that's what it's all about. And I think that probably the best parents are ones that have a growth mindset. not because they are better than anybody else at parenting, because they are constantly trying to do differently and to learn from what their mistakes. And that is true in many respects, especially and even in conversations about racism.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. Such a pleasure.